Some moments change everything, and for one Apache warrior, that moment came when he heard a child's terrified cry echoing across a dusty town square. Nothing could have prepared Raven for what he witnessed that day. A 6-year-old girl named Luna being sold like cattle to cruel settlers who saw her only as free labor. This warrior had survived decades of battles and loss, but watching this innocent child, stripped of everything, broke something deep inside him. Without thinking of the consequences, Raven took her. He became her protector, her teacher, and eventually her father. But taking Luna meant declaring war on every settler, bounty hunter, and lawman who wanted her back. They thought they were chasing down just another Apache and a runaway child. They had no idea they were hunting a man who would move heaven and earth to keep his daughter safe. This is the story of an unlikely family, forged in the fires of the Old West. But when the entire territory turns against them, will love be enough to overcome the hatred that threatens to destroy them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona Territory in 1873 was a land where mercy died with the sunset, and Raven had learned this truth through 37 years of hard living. He crouched now behind a weathered boulder on the ridge overlooking Copper Ridge, his calloused fingers unconsciously stroking the worn leather medicine pouch that hung from his neck. Inside that pouch were all that remained of his previous life: a lock of his wife's hair, a small stone his son had painted with ochre, and a piece of turquoise his daughter had found by the stream behind their wickiup. That life had ended 3 summers ago when Captain Jeremiah Walsh's cavalry unit had swept through their peaceful camp at dawn, claiming they were hunting renegades. Raven had returned from a hunting trip to find smoking ruins and bodies scattered like autumn leaves. His wife, Singing Bird, had been shot while trying to protect their children. His son, Little Fox, only 8 winters old, had taken a saber cut defending his sister. His daughter, Morning Star, barely 5, had simply vanished, likely taken by the soldiers or the settlers who followed in their wake like vultures. The Apache warrior, who had once been known for his gentle way with horses and his skill at crafting arrows, now carried a different reputation. The white settlements called him Ghost Walker, the shadow who struck without warning and disappeared into the desert like morning mist. But Raven knew the truth. He was no ghost, merely a man hollowed out by grief, moving through a world that had stolen everything he had ever loved. Copper Ridge sprawled below him like a festering wound on the desert floor. What had started as a modest trading post had grown into something far more sinister under the leadership of Mayor Cornelius Pike and Sheriff Dutch Wagner. The town's prosperity came from a business that made Raven's stomach turn: the systematic capture and sale of Apache children. The process was brutally efficient. Raiding parties would strike Apache camps, killing the adults and taking the children. The youngest ones, those under 10, were brought to Copper Ridge's weekly auctions. Boys were sold as laborers to work the mines or tend livestock. Girls were purchased as household servants, or worse. The older children, those considered too dangerous or difficult to control, were shipped east to government schools, where their Apache heritage would be beaten out of them. Sheriff Wagner stood at the center of it all, a mountain of a man with pale eyes that seemed to find amusement in others' suffering. He had arrived in Copper Ridge 2 years earlier with a small army of deputies and a mandate from territorial authorities to pacify the Apache problem. His methods were thorough and profitable. Each child sold brought the town a percentage, and Wagner's personal cut was rumored to be substantial. The auction platform stood in the town's main square, built from pine logs hauled down from the mountains. Today, like every Thursday, it would host its grim commerce. Raven had been watching for weeks, learning the patterns, counting the guards, memorizing every escape route. He told himself he was gathering intelligence for a larger strike against the settlement, but deep in his heart, where the medicine pouch rested against his chest, he knew he was looking for something else entirely. Luna had arrived 3 days ago in a wagon filled with 6 other Apache children, all of them silent and hollow-eyed. She was small even for her 6 years, with long black hair that hung in tangles and dark eyes that seemed to hold far too much knowledge for someone so young. When the other children huddled together for warmth and comfort, she sat apart, her thin shoulders rigid with the kind of pride that Raven recognized, the refusal to break even when everything else had been taken. There was something about her that called to the deepest parts of his grief. Perhaps it was the way she tilted her chin up when Wagner's men came too close, or how she whispered what sounded like Apache prayers when she thought no one was listening. Or perhaps it was simply that she reminded him of Morning Star, the daughter he had failed to protect. The town was already stirring as the sun climbed higher. Raven could see Wagner's deputies positioning themselves around the square, their rifles gleaming in the morning light. The auctioneer, a thin man called Graves, was setting up his podium and checking his ledger. Potential buyers were arriving, ranchers looking for cheap labor, mine foremen seeking small hands for dangerous work, and worse sorts whose intentions Raven preferred not to contemplate. Dr. Marcus Webb, one of the few decent souls in Copper Ridge, stood near his small clinic, his face grim with the helpless anger of a man who had seen too much cruelty and possessed too little power to stop it. He had tried reasoning with Wagner, had even written letters to territorial authorities, but his protests fell on deaf ears. The Apache children brought prosperity to the region, and prosperity mattered more than conscience. As Raven watched, his memory drifted to the last conversation he had shared with his wife. Singing Bird had been mending a tear in Morning Star's dress, her needle flashing in the firelight. "The world is changing," she had said without looking up. "Our children will need to be strong in ways we never had to be." She had been right, though neither of them could have imagined how prescient those words would prove. The medicine pouch grew warm against his chest, and Raven closed his eyes, letting himself hear Singing Bird's voice one more time. She would not have approved of what he had become, this hollow man who moved through the shadows dealing death. But she would understand what he was about to do. A child was suffering, and in the Apache way, that made her everyone's daughter, everyone's responsibility. Raven opened his eyes and began his descent toward the town. He moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to read the land's moods, avoiding loose stones that might betray his presence. His weapons were simple but effective. A knife, forged from meteoric iron, a war club his grandfather had carved, and a rifle taken from a cavalry officer who would never need it again. The sun was nearing its zenith when the auction began. Raven had positioned himself in an alley between the general store and the blacksmith shop, close enough to see everything but hidden in shadow. The first children brought to the platform were older boys, their defiance still visible despite their chains. They sold quickly to mine supervisors who cared more about the size of their hands than the hatred in their eyes. Then Luna was led forward, and something fundamental shifted in Raven's chest. She walked with her head held high, even though her wrists were bound and her dress was little more than rags. When Graves began his description of her age and potential uses, she looked directly at the crowd, her dark eyes meeting the gaze of each potential buyer without flinching. "Here's a pretty little thing," Graves called out, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a man selling livestock. "Apache, about 6 years old, healthy and strong. She'll make a fine kitchen girl or nursemaid. Bids start at $20. A rancher near the front raised his hand. "25. 30, called another voice. Raven's hands began to shake. In Luna's proud stance, in the way she refused to show fear, even as grown men haggled over her life, he saw not just Morning Star, but all the Apache children who had been lost to this monstrous trade. The bidding continued. Each increase in price another nail in the coffin of innocence. $50, came a gravelly voice from the back of the crowd. Raven turned to see Matthias Grant, a man whose reputation for cruelty to his servants was well known even among the hardened residents of Copper Ridge. Luna's eyes found Grant, and for the first time, Raven saw her composure crack slightly. She was still a child, still capable of fear when confronted with true evil. The medicine pouch burned against Raven's chest like a brand. He could almost hear Singing Bird's voice. A warrior's first duty is to the innocent. Morning Star's laughter seemed to echo from the pouch, bright and pure and heartbreakingly lost. The bidding reached $60, then $70. With each increase, Luna seemed to grow smaller on the platform, though her spine remained straight. Raven made his decision. Tonight, when darkness covered the land and the decent people of Copper Ridge locked their doors against the desert's dangers, the Ghost Walker would walk again. But this time he would not be dealing death. This time he would be saving a life. The moon was a silver crescent hanging low over Copper Ridge when Raven began his descent into the settlement. He had spent the afternoon hours in meditation, preparing his spirit for what was to come. The medicine pouch lay heavy against his chest, and he whispered a prayer to the ancestors, asking not for victory, but for wisdom. This rescue would be different from his usual raids. Stealth, not violence, would be his greatest weapon. Luna had been sold to Grant for $85, the highest price paid that day. The transaction had been completed with the same casual indifference men might show when purchasing a horse or a tool. Grant had even examined Luna's teeth and hands before nodding his approval to Graves. The sight had filled Raven with a cold rage that he now channeled into focus. The child was being held in a reinforced shed behind the sheriff's office, along with 2 other Apache children, who would be transported to buyers in distant territories come morning. Bigner had posted 2 guards, young deputies named Collins and Murphy, who spent more time drinking than watching. Raven had observed their patterns for hours. They would make their rounds every 30 minutes, then return to their card game and whiskey bottle. Moving through the settlement's back alleys like liquid shadow, Raven approached the shed. The building was solid, but not impregnable. Thick wooden walls with a barred window too small for an adult, but perhaps large enough for a child. The door was secured with a heavy iron padlock. But Raven had not survived 3 decades of warfare by allowing locks to stop him. From his position behind a stack of empty grain barrels, he could see Collins and Murphy through the office window. They were deep in their cups, and a heated discussion about poker debts perfect. Raven slipped from shadow to shadow until he reached the shed's rear wall. Through a gap between the boards, he could hear soft weeping, not Luna, but one of the other children. Then he heard something that stopped his breath. Luna's voice, barely a whisper, speaking in Apache. "Do not cry, little brother. The spirits have not forgotten us. Help will come." The silver bracelet on Luna's thin wrist caught a beam of moonlight as she comforted the younger child. It was a simple piece of jewelry, but Raven could see it meant everything to her, likely the last connection to her murdered family. "Who are you?" Luna's voice came again, this time in English, and directed toward the wall where Raven crouched. The warrior froze. He had made no sound, disturbed no shadows. How could she possibly know he was there? "I am Apache," he whispered back in their native tongue, his voice barely audible. "I have come to take you home." There was silence for a moment. Then Luna spoke again, her voice carrying a wisdom far beyond her years. "There is no home left for any of us." "Then we will make a new one," Raven replied, and was surprised by the conviction in his own words. The sound of boots on wooden steps announced the guard's next patrol. Raven melted back into the shadows as Collins stumbled around the building's perimeter, his rifle held carelessly in one hand. The deputy was drunk enough to be sloppy, but sober enough to be dangerous. When he completed his circuit and returned to the office, Raven counted to 100 before moving. The lock yielded to a technique Raven had learned from a Mexican vaquero years ago. A thin strip of metal worked just so, combined with gentle pressure and patience. The mechanism clicked open with a sound barely louder than a cricket's chirp. Inside the shed, 3 pairs of eyes stared at him from the darkness. Luna sat in the center, her arms around a boy of perhaps 4 years and a girl who could not have been more than 7. All 3 children were chained to iron rings set into the floor. But the chains were long enough to allow them to huddle together. "I am called Raven," he whispered, kneeling before Luna. "I will not leave you here." Luna studied his face in the dim moonlight streaming through the window. "You are the Ghost Walker, the one who kills the evil men." Raven's throat tightened. Even the children knew what he had become. "Tonight I am just a man trying to save 3 children. The locks on their chains were more complex, but Raven's fingers had grown skilled at such work. As he freed each child, he could feel their fear giving way to cautious hope. The boy, who whispered that his name was Hawk, clung to Luna's dress. The girl, called Dove, trembled like her namesake. "Listen carefully," Raven said, his voice urgent but calm. "We will leave through the back streets. Stay close to me, make no sound. If we are discovered, you must run toward the desert. Do not look back. Do not wait for me. Run until you find the tall rocks that look like sleeping giants, then hide until the sun rises." Luna nodded solemnly. "What of them?" She gestured toward Hawk and Dove. "They come with us." "But you came for me," Luna said with that unsettling insight that seemed to pierce straight through to truth. Raven met her gaze. "I came for all of you." They moved through the settlement like ghosts themselves, Raven leading and Luna bringing up the rear, her small hand guiding the younger children. The warrior's heart hammered against his ribs as they navigated between buildings, past sleeping houses, where decent people dreamed untroubled dreams. They had nearly reached the settlement's edge when disaster struck. A dog began barking, a large hound tied behind the bakery that had caught their scent. The sound shattered the night's quiet like breaking glass. "Run," Raven commanded, scooping Dove into his arms while Luna took Hawk's hand. Behind them, he could hear shouts erupting from the sheriff's office. Colin's voice, suddenly sharp with alarm. "The shed! Check the shed!" They sprinted through the darkness, leaving the settlement's scattered lights behind. But the desert that had always been Raven's ally now seemed to stretch endlessly before them, offering little cover. The children's breathing grew labored, and young Hawk stumbled repeatedly. The sound of horses reached them, Wagner's posse moving fast. Raven knew these men, had evaded them before, but he had never tried to escape while protecting 3 small children. "I cannot run more," Dove gasped, her small body shaking with exhaustion. Raven's mind raced through options. The nearest Apache stronghold was 3 days' hard travel north. There were closer places to hide, but Wagner knew the territory almost as well as he did. Almost. Then Luna spoke, her voice cutting through his desperate calculations. "There is a place. The old mine shaft where my father once sheltered during a storm. The white men think it is haunted." Raven knew the place. An abandoned silver mine in a box canyon, avoided by the superstitious townspeople. It was risky, potentially a trap, but better than trying to outrun horses while carrying exhausted children. They changed direction, moving toward the dark silhouette of Burial Mesa. Behind them, the search was spreading out, torches flickering like angry stars. Wagner's voice carried across the desert, promising $100 for the children's return and $200 for the Ghost Walker's scalp. The mine shaft was a black mouth in the canyon wall, its entrance partially concealed by fallen rocks. Raven had scouted it years ago as a potential hideout, but had never needed to use it. Now, as he guided the children into its sheltering darkness, he whispered another prayer to the ancestors. Inside, they huddled together while the sound of the search party echoed from the canyon beyond. Luna sat pressed against Raven's side, her thin body still trembling from their flight. In her small hand, she clutched the silver bracelet, her only connection to a family that existed now only in memory. "What happens now?" she whispered. Raven looked down at this brave child who had comforted others even in her own terror, who had led them to safety when his own knowledge had faltered. Something shifted in his heart, a feeling he had thought buried forever with his family. "Now we rest," he said softly, "and then we find a way to live." Outside, Wagner's men continued their search, their torches growing distant as they followed false trails deeper into the desert. For now, they were safe. But Raven knew this was only the beginning. By taking these children, he had declared war on every bounty hunter, lawman, and settler who profited from their suffering. As Luna finally fell asleep against his shoulder, her silver bracelet catching the faint starlight that filtered through the mine entrance, Raven made a silent vow. He would protect these children, especially this fierce little girl who had somehow begun to heal the wounds in his broken heart, even if it cost him everything. 3 days had passed since their escape from Copper Ridge, and the old mine had become their temporary home. Raven had chosen the location well. The canyon provided natural protection, water seeped from the rocks in a steady trickle, and the superstitions of the white settlers kept them from venturing too close. But he knew their safety was an illusion that could shatter at any moment. Luna had proven herself remarkable in those first difficult days. While Hawk and Dove struggled with nightmares and bouts of weeping, she remained steady as granite. She helped Raven gather edible plants, shared her portions of food with the younger children, and somehow managed to keep their spirits from breaking entirely. But Raven could see the cost of her strength in the dark circles under her eyes and the way she sometimes stared at nothing, lost in memories too heavy for such small shoulders. On the 3rd evening, as the desert air grew cool and the first stars appeared, Raven sat by their small, carefully concealed fire and began whittling. His knife moved steadily through a piece of dried mesquite wood, shaping it with the same patient precision he had once used to craft arrows for his son. The children watched him work, drawn by the rhythmic scraping sound and the way his weathered hands seemed to coax life from the wood. "What are you making?" Dove asked, her voice still carrying the whispered quality it had held since their escape. "A horse," Raven replied, not looking up from his work. "A horse for Luna." Luna's eyes widened. "For me?" "Every warrior needs a horse," Raven said, testing the smoothness of the carved mane with his thumb. "Even if it is only as large as your hand." As he worked, memories of his own children drifted through his mind like smoke. He had carved similar toys for Little Fox and Morning Star, a bear for the boy, a bird for the girl. They had played with those toys until the wood grew smooth and dark from handling, creating elaborate games and stories that could occupy them for hours. The pain of those memories should have been unbearable. But somehow, watching Luna's face light up as the horse took shape, Raven found the ache beginning to transform into something warmer. Not healing, not yet, but perhaps the first hint that healing might someday be possible. "My father carved animals too," Luna said quietly, settling closer to watch his work. "He made me a rabbit that could stand on its hind legs. I lost it when the soldiers came." Raven's knife stilled for a moment. "What was your father's name?" "Dancing Wolf." Luna's voice carried pride despite her grief. "He was a great hunter. My mother said he could track a raindrop through a thunderstorm." "I knew Dancing Wolf," Raven said, and saw Luna's eyes widen. "He was indeed a great hunter, and a good man." The simple words seemed to unlock something in Luna. For the first time since he had found her, tears began to flow down her cheeks, not the silent weeping of despair, but the cleansing tears of a child who had finally found someone who understood her loss. Raven set down his carving and opened his arms. Luna came to him without hesitation, pressing her face against his chest as the grief she had been holding back finally found release. He held her gently, the way he had once comforted his own children, and murmured words of comfort in Apache. "He loved you very much," Raven said softly, "and he would be proud of how brave you have been." When Luna's tears finally subsided, Raven returned to his carving. The wooden horse was nearly complete now, its form simple but elegant. As he put the finishing touches on the piece, he found himself thinking about the future for the first time in years. Not the grim day-to-day survival that had consumed him since his family's death, but something beyond that, a purpose larger than revenge. "There," he said, offering the carved horse to Luna. "What will you name him?" Luna accepted the gift reverently, turning it over in her small hands. "Swift runner," she decided after a moment's consideration, "because he will carry me far from the bad men." As Luna showed the carving to Hawk and Dove, their faces brightening with the first real smiles Raven had seen since the rescue, he felt something shift in his chest. The hollow space where his heart had once been was still there, still ached with loss, but it was no longer empty. These three children, cast adrift by the same forces that had destroyed his own family, were beginning to fill that space with their trust and their need, but their peace was interrupted by a sound that chilled Raven's blood, the distant baying of hounds. Hugna had brought tracking dogs. "Gather your things," Raven commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. "We leave now." The children responded instantly to the tone of command, scooping up their few possessions with practiced efficiency. 3 days of hiding had taught them valuable lessons about speed and silence. As they emerged from the mine shaft, Raven could see torches flickering in the distance like malevolent stars. The posse was still miles away, but the dogs would follow their scent relentlessly. They needed to reach water, a stream or river where they could mask their trail. "Where do we go?" Luna asked, clutching her wooden horse tightly. Raven considered their options. North lay the Apache strongholds, but the journey would be treacherous with children. South led deeper into territory controlled by the army. East and west offered only more desert and the certainty of being run to ground by men on horseback. Then he remembered something Dancing Wolf had mentioned years ago, a hidden canyon system that twisted through the Dragoon Mountains like the veins in a leaf. The passages were narrow, too narrow for horses, and led to a series of natural caves that had sheltered Apache families for generations. "We go to the place of many echoes," Raven said, using the Apache name for the canyon system. "Your father showed me the entrance once, long ago." The baying of the hounds grew closer as they began their climb toward the mountains. Raven set a pace that pushed the children to their limits but did not break them. Luna helped Hawk when he stumbled, while Dove, despite her fear, never complained about the grueling ascent. As they climbed, Raven found himself marveling at Luna's resilience. She had lost everything: family, home, the innocence of childhood, yet she pressed on with a determination that reminded him of the finest Apache warriors he had known. More than that, she had somehow retained her capacity for compassion, her instinct to protect those smaller and weaker than herself. When they finally reached the hidden entrance to the canyon system, a crack in the rock face barely wide, enough for a man to squeeze through sideways, Luna was the first to disappear into its depths. Her trust was absolute, her faith in his protection complete. As Raven followed her into the narrow passage, the wooden horse still clutched in her hand, he realized that something fundamental had changed. He was no longer just the ghost walker, the hollow man who dealt death in the shadows. These children, especially Luna, were calling him back to life, back to the man he had been before grief consumed him. The hounds baying echoed off the canyon walls behind them, a reminder that their enemies were relentless. But for the first time since his family's death, Raven felt something stronger than despair. He felt hope. Captain Morrison had arrived in Copper Ridge like a storm front, bringing with him a reputation forged in blood and a compass that never failed to find its quarry. The ornate brass instrument, inherited from his grandfather, who had served in the Confederate Navy, had guided him across 3 territories in pursuit of his prey. Sheriff Wagner had hired the best tracker money could buy, and Morrison's price, $500 for the ghost walker and the children, was steep but fair considering his record. Inside the canyon system that Luna had called the place of many echoes, Raven watched his small family adapt to their new circumstances with a mixture of pride and concern. The hidden caves provided excellent shelter, and an underground stream supplied fresh water, but he could see the strain beginning to tell on the children. Dove had developed a persistent cough, and Hawk barely spoke above a whisper. Only Luna seemed to thrive in their rocky sanctuary. "Teach me to hunt," she said one morning, as Raven prepared to venture out in search of food. He studied her serious expression. At 6 years old, she was small even for her age, her thin arms lacking the strength to draw even the lightest bough. But there was something in her eyes, a fierce determination that reminded him achingly of Morning Star. "Hunting requires patience above all else," he said, settling cross-legged beside her. "Before you can take life to sustain life, you must understand how all living things are connected." Luna nodded solemnly, her wooden horse clutched in one hand. "My father said the deer allows itself to be caught when it chooses to feed the people." Dancing Wolf was a wise teacher. Raven reached for a handful of pebbles from the cave floor. "Watch carefully." He arranged the stones in a complex pattern, creating a miniature representation of the desert ecosystem. Each pebble represented a different creature: rabbits, hawks, coyotes, snakes. As he moved the stones, he explained the delicate balance that governed life and death in their harsh environment. "The rabbit feeds the hawk," he said, moving one stone closer to another. "The hawk's droppings feed the plants that shelter the rabbit. Even in death, the hawk returns to the earth to nourish new life. Nothing is wasted, nothing is forgotten." Luna studied the pattern intently, her young mind grasping concepts that many adult warriors struggled to understand. "Where do we fit in the pattern?" The question struck Raven like a physical blow. Where indeed did they fit? They were neither fully part of the Apache world, nor accepted in the white man's society. They existed in the spaces between, hunted by both sides, belonging nowhere. "We make our own pattern," he said finally. "We create a new balance." That afternoon, while the younger children napped, Raven began Luna's first real lesson in survival. He showed her how to identify animal tracks in the dust, how to read the story written in disturbed earth and broken twigs. Her progress was remarkable. Within hours, she could distinguish between the prints of different birds and accurately guess how long ago various creatures had passed through the area. "You have your father's eyes," Raven observed as she knelt beside a set of rabbit tracks, her small fingers tracing their outline. "I remember him teaching me," Luna said softly. "Before the soldiers came, he would take me into the desert and show me secret places. He said I would need to know the land's secrets to survive." The weight of that prophetic statement settled over them both. Dancing Wolf had somehow known that his daughter would need such knowledge far sooner than any child should. Their peaceful afternoon was interrupted by Hawk's frightened voice echoing from the cave entrance. "Men coming!" Men with dogs. Raven's blood turned to ice water. Morrison had found them. Moving with the fluid efficiency of a man who had faced death countless times, Raven gathered their few possessions while the children prepared for another flight. But as he peered through a crack in the rocks toward the canyon entrance, his heart sank. Morrison had positioned his men perfectly, 6 armed riders blocking every escape route, their dogs straining at their leashes. The captain himself sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who had never failed to claim his bounty. His compass glinted in the afternoon sun as he studied it one final time, then snapped it shut with a decisive click. "I know you can hear me, Ghost Walker." Morrison's voice carried clearly through the thin desert air. "You've led us a fine chase, but it's over now. Send out the children, and we'll make this quick and clean." Raven closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his failures pressing down like stones. He had led these innocent children into a trap. The canyon that had seemed like salvation was about to become their tomb. But Luna appeared beside him, her small hand slipping into his with complete trust. "What do we do now?" Looking down at her brave face, Raven felt something ignite in his chest. Not the cold fire of revenge that had sustained him for 3 years, but something warmer and infinitely more powerful. These children had given him back his humanity, had reminded him what it meant to love and be loved. He would not fail them as he had failed his own family. "There is another way out," he whispered, though he wasn't entirely certain it was true. "A passage your father showed me years ago. It is dangerous, but it leads to the high country where horses cannot follow." Luna's eyes lit up with hope. "He told me about the secret way. He said only those pure of heart could find it." As Morrison's men began their methodical approach, checking every shadow and crevice, Raven led his small family deeper into the cave system. The passage, Luna remembered, was barely wide enough for a child. A natural chimney that angled upward through solid rock toward the mesa top hundreds of feet above. "I'll go first," Luna declared with typical courage. "If the way is clear, I'll call down to you." Watching her disappear into the narrow opening, her wooden horse tucked safely in her dress pocket, Raven felt his throat tighten with emotion. This brave child, who had already lost everything once, was willing to risk everything again to save them all. The sound of Morrison's dogs grew closer as they waited for Luna's signal. Dove huddled against Raven's side while Hawk peered anxiously upward into the darkness. The minutes stretched like hours until finally, blessedly, Luna's voice drifted down from somewhere far above. "The way is open. Come quickly." As they began their desperate ascent, following Luna's courage into the unknown darkness above, Raven whispered a prayer of gratitude to Dancing Wolf's spirit. The man's final gift to his daughter, knowledge of this secret passage, might yet save them all. But even if they escaped Morrison this time, Raven knew the captain would not give up easily. The ornate compass would find them again, and next time they might not be so fortunate. Next time he would need to be ready to fight. The high mesa stretched before them like a vast table set for giants, its surface broken by weathered spires and deep arroyos that twisted toward the distant mountains. They had emerged from Luna's secret passage after a harrowing climb that had taken most of the night. And now the four fugitives stood blinking in the harsh morning sun, their bodies aching but their spirits unbroken. Raven had made a decision during those long hours in the darkness. They would seek refuge with his cousin, Stone Bear, whose band maintained a stronghold deep in the Chiricahua Mountains. It was a journey of at least a week on foot, but the high country offered advantages that the desert plains could not. Here, among the pine-covered slopes and hidden valleys, the Apache way of life still held sway. Before they departed the mesa, Raven performed a ritual he had not practiced since his family's death. From his medicine pouch, he withdrew a small clay pot filled with red ochre and charcoal. With careful, reverent movements, he began to paint his face with the traditional markings of an Apache warrior going into battle. "What are you doing?" Luna asked, watching the transformation with wide eyes. "I'm remembering who I am," Raven replied, drawing a line of red ochre from his temple to his jaw. "For too long, I have been only the ghost walker, a shadow seeking revenge. But you have reminded me that I am also Raven of the Chiricahua, son of Thundercloud, protector of the innocent." The ancient clay pot had belonged to his grandfather, a war leader who had fought against Mexican soldiers and American cavalry with equal ferocity. The pigments inside were sacred, mixed according to rituals passed down through generations of warriors. As Raven applied the paint, he felt the weight of his ancestors' expectations settling on his shoulders like a familiar cloak. Luna watched the ceremony with solemn attention, understanding instinctively that she was witnessing something significant. When Raven finished, she reached up to touch the red markings with one small finger. "You look like a real warrior now," she said with childlike wonder. "I have always been a warrior," Raven replied gently. "But for the first time in years, I'm fighting for something more important than revenge." Their journey toward the mountains began at first light, with Raven setting a pace that challenged but did not overwhelm the children. Luna had grown stronger during their weeks of hiding, her small body adapting to the harsh demands of life on the run. She helped Hawk when he struggled with the steep terrain, and kept Dove's spirits up with stories her father had told her about the mountain spirits who watched over Apache children. As they traveled, Raven found himself teaching Luna the skills her father would have passed on under different circumstances. He showed her how to read the subtle signs that indicated water nearby, how to identify edible plants, and how to move through the forest without disturbing the natural harmony of the wilderness. "The land speaks to those who know how to listen," he explained as they paused beside a hidden spring to fill their water containers. "Your footsteps should be like whispers, your presence like morning mist." Luna absorbed every lesson with the intensity of a child who understood that knowledge meant survival. But it was more than that. Raven could see in her eyes the same deep connection to the natural world that had made her father such a skilled hunter. She was not just learning techniques, she was discovering her heritage. On their third day in the mountains, they encountered their first Apache scout, a young warrior named Wind Rider, who materialized from the forest like a spirit-given form. His initial wariness melted when he recognized Raven, and his eyes widened when he heard the story of their escape from Copper Ridge. "Stone Bear's band is 2 days north," Wind Rider reported. "But you should know, the army has been pushing hard into our territory. Many families have been forced to relocate to the reservation lands." Raven's jaw tightened. The reservation system was another form of prison, designed to break Apache spirit by severing their connection to the sacred places of their ancestors. Children on the reservations were forbidden to speak their native language or practice their traditional customs. It was cultural death by slow strangulation. "What of my cousin?" Raven asked. "Stone Bear refuses to surrender. His warriors grow fewer each month, but those who remain are committed to the old ways." Wind Rider glanced at Luna and the other children. "He will welcome you, especially the little ones. Apache children are precious to us now. There are so few left free." That evening, as they made camp in a grove of ancient pines, Luna approached Raven with a question that had clearly been troubling her for some time. "Will I ever see the place where my father is buried?" The simple question hit Raven like a physical blow. In all their planning and running, he had never considered that Luna might want to return to the scene of her family's destruction. But of course she would. The Apache way demanded proper respect for the dead, and Luna had never been given the chance to say goodbye. "Perhaps someday," he said carefully, "when it is safe." Luna nodded, accepting the uncertainty with the stoic grace that seemed to be her natural response to life's cruelties. But her next words revealed the depth of thought hidden behind her young face. "I dream about him sometimes," she said quietly. "He tells me that I am growing strong, that he is proud of the woman I will become. But he also says I must not forget where I came from, even when the world tries to make me forget." Raven felt his heart clench with emotion. This child, who had witnessed horrors no young person should ever see, was somehow maintaining her connection to her cultural identity despite being torn from everything familiar. Her resilience humbled him. "Your father's spirit lives in you," he said softly. "As long as you remember his teachings, he will never truly be gone." Luna smiled then, the first truly joyful expression he had seen from her since their escape. "And you will help me remember?" "For as long as I draw breath," Raven promised, and meant every word. As the fire burned low and the children settled into sleep, Raven stared up at the star-filled sky and contemplated the changes that had transformed his life. 3 weeks ago, he had been a hollow man driven by nothing but the need for vengeance. Now he was a father again, responsible for 3 young lives that depended on him for everything from food and shelter to hope and guidance. The transformation terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. But as he watched Luna sleep peacefully beside the dying embers, her wooden horse clutched protectively against her chest, Raven knew that he had found his true purpose at last. Tomorrow they would reach Stone Bear's stronghold, and he would have to explain how the Ghost Walker had become a protector of children. But tonight, surrounded by the timeless peace of the mountain forest, he was simply a man watching over his family, and for the first time in 3 years, that was enough. Stone Bear's stronghold occupied a natural amphitheater high in the Chiricahuas, surrounded by towering cliffs that provided both protection and concealment. As Raven led his small family through the final approach, Luna gasped with wonder at the sight of Apache families living freely according to the old ways. Children played traditional games, while their mothers worked hides and their fathers crafted weapons, all under the watchful eyes of sentries positioned on the surrounding ridges. But Raven's trained eye also saw what Luna could not: the signs of a people under siege. There were too few children, too many empty spaces where wiki-ups should have stood. The warriors bore the lean look of men who'd been fighting a losing battle for too long. Stonebear himself emerged from the largest dwelling, his massive frame moving with surprising grace. Raven's cousin had aged considerably since their last meeting, his hair now more silver than black, but his eyes still held the fierce intelligence that had made him a legendary war leader. "Ghostwalker," Stonebear said formally. Then his expression softened. "No, you are Raven again. I can see it in your face." The reunion was emotional but brief. Apache custom demanded that Raven explain his presence and his purposes before the assembled elders. As Luna and the other children were led away to be fed and cared for by the women, Raven found himself seated before a council fire, facing men whose wisdom was matched only by their desperation. "You bring us 3 Apache children saved from slavery," said Grey Owl, the eldest of the council. "This is good. But you also bring the attention of our enemies. Captain Morrison's reputation is known to us. He has killed many of our warriors." Raven reached into his shirt and withdrew a folded paper he had taken from a cavalry officer months earlier. It was a treaty document, but not the kind the government typically offered to Apache bands. This one laid out a systematic plan for the complete removal of all Apache peoples from Arizona territory within 5 years. "The white leaders no longer pretend to seek peace," Raven said, spreading the document before the council. "They plan to drive every Apache onto reservations in New Mexico, far from our sacred places. The children they steal are not just slaves, they are the next generation, raised to forget they are Apache." The council members read the document with growing horror. The plan was comprehensive and ruthless: forced relocations, the kidnapping of children for education in distant schools, the systematic destruction of Apache cultural sites. It was genocide disguised as policy. "How do we fight this?" asked Stonebear, his voice heavy with the weight of leadership. "By becoming what we have never been before," Raven replied. "United." The word hung in the air like smoke from the sacred fire. Apache bands had always been fiercely independent, cooperating when necessary but maintaining their autonomy. The idea of true unity, of all Apache people standing together, was both revolutionary and terrifying. As the debate continued into the night, Luna sat with the other children around a smaller fire, listening to stories told by Singing Dove, Stonebear's wife. The old woman had a gift for bringing the ancient tales to life, her voice rising and falling with dramatic effect as she recounted the adventures of trickster spirits and brave warriors. "Tell us about the Star Maiden," Luna requested during a pause in the storytelling. Singing Dove smiled. "Ah, that is a story for brave girls who face impossible odds. Are you sure you are ready to hear it?" Luna nodded solemnly, and the other children leaned closer as Singing Dove began the tale of a young Apache woman who had been stolen by enemy raiders, but found a way to escape by following the star that never moves. It was clearly chosen specifically for Luna, and the child listened with rapt attention as the Star Maiden overcame each obstacle through courage and clever thinking. Meanwhile, around the council fire, the debate had grown heated. Some of the elders argued for accepting the inevitable and negotiating the best possible terms for their people's surrender. Others called for a final, glorious battle against impossible odds. But Raven proposed something different. "We do not surrender, and we do not throw our lives away in hopeless charges," he said. "Instead, we become what the white men fear most: invisible. We take back our children from their schools and auctions. We strike their supply lines and disappear before they can respond. We make them understand that the cost of destroying the Apache will be higher than they are willing to pay." Stonebear studied his cousin's face in the firelight. "You speak of war without honor, of fighting like ghosts in the night." "I speak of survival," Raven replied firmly. "Our honor means nothing if there are no Apache children left to carry it forward." The council meeting lasted until dawn, with heated arguments and passionate speeches from all sides. But gradually Raven's vision began to take shape. They would not unite as a single army. That would be too easy for the cavalry to track and destroy. Instead, they would become a network of small, independent cells, each capable of striking swiftly and vanishing into the wilderness. As the sun rose over the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the stronghold, Luna approached Raven, where he sat exhausted, but determined beside the dying council fire. The Star Maiden found her way home, she said simply, settling beside him. But first, she had to become stronger than she ever thought possible. Raven looked down at this remarkable child who seemed to understand truths that eluded many adults. What made her strong? Knowing that other people needed her to succeed, Luna replied. She could not give up because children were counting on her to show them the way home. The innocent words struck Raven with the force of prophecy. Luna was right. This was not just about their small family anymore. Every Apache child stolen from their people, every family torn apart by the government's policies, was counting on leaders who would not abandon them to their fate. You are very wise for someone so young, Raven said softly. Luna shrugged with childlike modesty. Singing Dove says wisdom comes from listening to the right stories. I think you have been listening to the right stories too. As the stronghold began to stir with the activities of a new day, Raven felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. The council had agreed to his plan, but implementation would be dangerous and difficult. They would need to gather allies from bands scattered across the territory, coordinate complex operations across vast distances, and somehow maintain unity among fiercely independent warriors. But looking at Luna, who was already organizing Hawk and Dove for their morning meal, Raven felt his resolve crystallize like quartz forming in desert heat. These children represented the future of the Apache people, not just their survival, but their hope of maintaining their identity in a world determined to erase them. The real war was just beginning. 2 weeks had passed since the council meeting that changed everything, and Stone Bear's stronghold had become a hub of carefully orchestrated activity. Warriors arrived daily from scattered bands, drawn by whispered messages carried along ancient communication networks. The sight of so many Apache gathered in one place should have filled Raven with hope. But instead, he found himself increasingly troubled by a nagging sense that something was wrong. Luna had adapted to life in the stronghold with remarkable ease, throwing herself into learning traditional skills from the women, while absorbing tactical knowledge from conversations she overheard among the warriors. Her quick mind and natural leadership abilities had made her a favorite among both children and adults. But it was her uncanny ability to notice details that others missed that had begun to concern Raven. The new warrior, Broken Arrow, asked too many questions about our plans, she mentioned casually one morning as they sat together watching the sunrise paint the mountain peaks gold and red. Raven's attention sharpened immediately. Broken Arrow had arrived 3 days earlier, claiming to represent a band from the White Mountain region. His credentials seemed legitimate, and his knowledge of Apache customs was comprehensive, but something about him had struck Raven as slightly off-kilter. What kind of questions? Raven asked carefully. He wants to know how many warriors we have, where the other bands are gathering, when we plan to strike first. Luna's dark eyes were serious beyond her years. The kind of questions my father said a scout asks before an attack. Before Raven could respond, a commotion erupted from the center of the stronghold. Singing Dove's voice rose above the general hubbub, calling for help with urgent distress. Raven and Luna hurried toward the sound, joined by dozens of others, drawn by the alarm in her voice. They found the old woman kneeling beside Luna's small sleeping area, holding something that made Raven's blood turn to ice water. It was a locket, small, silver, and ornately engraved with symbols that were unmistakably Apache. But it was not the craftsmanship that stopped his heart. It was the photograph visible through the opened locket's crystal face. The image showed a proud Apache war leader in full ceremonial dress, his bearing regal and his eyes fierce with intelligence and determination. Even in the faded sepia tones, his resemblance to Luna was unmistakable. More shocking still was Raven's recognition of the man. This was Chief Thunderheart, the legendary leader who had united 3 Apache bands in the Great War of 1869. "Where did you find this?" Stone Bear demanded, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Hidden in the child's clothing," Singing Dove replied, her hands trembling as she held the precious artifact. Sewn into the lining of her dress, so carefully concealed that only chance revealed it. Luna stared at the locket with an expression of dawning wonder and terror. "That is my grandfather," she whispered, "but my mother said he died when I was a baby. Killed by cavalry soldiers." "Thunderheart was no one's grandfather when he died," Grey Owl said slowly, his ancient voice heavy with the weight of terrible understanding. "He was childless, mourning the loss of his only son who had been killed in battle the previous spring." "No," Luna said, but her voice lacked conviction. "My mother told me stories about him, about how brave he was." "Child," Singing Dove interrupted gently, "what was your father's name before he took the name Dancing Wolf?" Luna's face went pale as understanding began to dawn. "She called him Lightning's Son, but she said it was just a childhood name. Lightning's Son was the name of Thunderheart's boy," Stone Bear said heavily. "The son who was supposed to have died in the battle at Spider Rock." The revelation hit the assembled Apache like a physical blow. If Luna was truly Thunderheart's granddaughter, she was not just another rescued child. She was the last living heir of the most revered Apache leader in recent memory. The man who had come closer than anyone to uniting all the Apache bands under a single banner. Raven felt the world tilting around him as the implications crashed over him in waves. This explained so much. Luna's natural leadership abilities, her instinctive understanding of Apache customs, despite her young age, the way other children automatically looked to her for guidance. More terrifying still, it explained why Morrison had been so relentless in his pursuit. The captain had not been chasing a random Apache child and her protector. He had been hunting the most valuable prize in the entire territory. "If the government learns of this," Grey Owl said slowly, "they will move heaven and earth to capture her. A living symbol of Apache resistance in their hands would be worth more than 1,000 warriors." "But in our hands," Stone Bear added with growing excitement, "she could be the rallying point we need to unite every Apache band from Mexico to Colorado." "No." Raven's voice cut through the rising murmur of excitement like a blade. "She's 6 years old. I will not see her turned into a symbol for other men to follow into battle." "You do not understand," Stone Bear said urgently. "This changes everything. With Thunderheart's granddaughter to unite behind, it changes nothing." Raven's voice rose to a roar that silenced every other voice in the stronghold. "She is a child who has already lost everything. I will not sacrifice her to our cause, no matter how noble." Luna, who had been listening to the debate with growing alarm, suddenly stepped forward. Her small voice carried clearly in the sudden silence, "What if I want to help?" Every eye turned to her, this tiny figure standing with unconscious dignity in the center of a circle of hardened warriors. The silver locket caught the morning light as it swayed gently from her neck, a tangible link to a legacy she was only beginning to understand. "I remember now," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "My mother used to sing me songs about a great chief who fought for all Apache people. She said his spirit lived on in his bloodline, waiting for the right time to awaken." She looked directly at Raven, her dark eyes bright with tears, but unwavering in their determination. "Maybe this is the right time." The stronghold erupted in voices as warriors began shouting their opinions, some supporting Raven's protective instincts, others arguing for Luna's importance as a symbol. But through the chaos, Raven heard something that chilled him to the bone, the distant sound of horses approaching at speed. "Riders coming," the sentry's voice carried from the clifftop. "Army patrol moving fast." In the pandemonium that followed, as warriors rushed to defensive positions and women gathered children to safety, Raven noticed one figure moving against the flow of activity. Broken Arrow was making his way toward the rear of the stronghold, toward the hidden trail that led down to the valley floor. Understanding struck Raven like lightning. The spy had gotten what he came for, confirmation of Luna's identity and the location of the stronghold. Morrison's systematic pursuit suddenly made perfect sense. The captain had not been tracking them through superior skill alone. He had been guided by information from a source within the Apache community itself. "Luna!" Raven called urgently. "Stay close to me!" But even as he shouted the warning, Raven knew that everything had changed. The secret that had been hidden for 6 years was out, and there would be no putting it back. Luna was no longer just his adopted daughter. She was Thunderheart's heir, the living embodiment of Apache resistance, and every enemy of the Apache people would be coming for her. The sacred eagle bone whistle hung from Stone Bear's neck like a promise of war, its polished surface gleaming in the firelight as Apache warriors gathered from across the territory answered the call to arms. The ancient instrument had been carved by Thunderheart himself from the wing bone of a golden eagle, and tradition held that its song could summon the spirits of all Apache warriors who had fallen defending their people. 3 days had passed since Morrison's cavalry patrol had attacked the stronghold, only to find it mysteriously abandoned. Broken Arrow's betrayal had cost them their safe haven, but it had also galvanized the scattered Apache bands in ways that years of diplomacy had failed to achieve. Word of Thunderheart's granddaughter had spread like wildfire through the hidden networks of the resistance, and now warriors who had feuded for generations stood shoulder to shoulder in common cause. Raven stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking the new gathering place, a natural amphitheater deep in the sacred mountains, where Apache bands had met for councils since time immemorial. Below him, more than 200 warriors prepared for what all understood would be the final confrontation. They came from every clan and band: Chiricahua, Mescalero, White Mountain, Jicarilla. For the first time since the arrival of the white man, the Apache were truly united. But it was the sight of Luna that filled Raven with both pride and terror. The revelation of her heritage had transformed her from a rescued child into something approaching a sacred figure. Warriors who had never seen her before spoke her name with reverence. Children who had escaped the government schools and reservation camps looked to her as a symbol of hope. Even the women, traditionally excluded from war councils, had demanded representation because Thunderheart's granddaughter would be present. "She grows into her legacy like a tree finding sunlight," Stone Bear observed, joining Raven on the outcrop. "Look how naturally she carries the weight of their expectations." Below them, Luna moved through the gathered warriors with unconscious grace, speaking words of encouragement, listening to stories of loss and resistance, somehow finding the perfect response for each individual. At 7 years old, she possessed the kind of natural leadership that could not be taught or faked. But Raven could see the cost in the shadows under her eyes and the way she sometimes paused to catch her breath, as if the weight of so many hopes was literally crushing her small frame. "She is still a child," Raven said quietly. "This burden should not be hers to carry." "But it is," Stone Bear replied, with the blunt honesty that had made him a respected leader. "The moment that locket was found, her childhood ended. We can protect her body, but we cannot protect her from her destiny." The ceremony began at sunset, as tradition demanded. Stone Bear raised the eagle bone whistle to his lips and sounded the call that had summoned Apache warriors for generations uncounted. The piercing note seemed to hang in the thin mountain air forever, echoing off the surrounding peaks until the very stones themselves seemed to sing with the voices of the ancestors. Luna stood at the center of the gathering, wearing a dress that Singing Dove had sewn for the occasion. The white doveskin was decorated with traditional symbols: thunderbirds for power, eagles for courage, and small silver studs that caught the firelight like captured stars. The silver locket rested at her throat, a visible reminder of the bloodline that connected her to every great Apache leader who had come before. "Brothers and sisters," Stone Bear began, his voice carrying easily across the assembled multitude. "We gather tonight not just to plan war, but to remember who we are. We are the people of the mountain spirits, the children of the desert winds. We are Apache." The response was thunderous, voices raised in the ancient war cries that their fathers and grandfathers had used to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. But when the sound died away, it was Luna's small voice that filled the silence. "My grandfather Thunderheart believed that Apache strength came not from our ability to make war, but from our willingness to sacrifice everything for our children's future," she said, her words carrying with preternatural clarity. "Tonight we do not gather to die gloriously. We gather to live freely." The wisdom in those words, coming from someone who had not yet reached her 8th birthday, struck the assembled warriors like lightning. This was not the rhetoric of revenge or desperation. This was the voice of true leadership, speaking to the deepest values that had sustained the Apache people through centuries of struggle. As the formal ceremony continued, with warrior after warrior stepping forward to pledge their loyalty to Thunderheart's heir, Raven found his attention drawn to the tactical challenges that lay ahead. Morrison had not been idle during the 3 days since his failed attack on the stronghold. Intelligence gathered by Apache scouts indicated that the captain had been reinforced by 2 companies of cavalry and a battalion of infantry, giving him nearly 500 soldiers to deploy against the Apache gathering. More troubling still were reports of the weapons Morrison had requested, not just the standard rifles and artillery pieces, but specialized equipment designed for mountain warfare. Gatling guns that could sweep defended positions clean, mortars that could drop shells into the deepest canyons, and most ominously, devices that the soldiers called Greek fire, some kind of incendiary compound that could turn entire forests into blazing death traps. "They mean to end this once and for all," Grey Owl observed during the strategic planning session that followed the ceremony. "Morrison understands that if we succeed in uniting the Apache bands permanently, the government's plans for the territory will become impossible to implement. Then we must ensure that our victory is complete," replied Wind from the mountains, a war leader whose band had been driven from their ancestral homes the previous year. "Half measures will only delay our final defeat." The debate that followed was intense and sometimes heated, with different leaders proposing strategies that ranged from direct assault to guerrilla warfare to negotiated settlement. But gradually, a consensus began to emerge around a plan that combined the best elements of each approach. They would not fight Morrison's army on terms that favored superior numbers and firepower. Instead, they would draw the soldiers deeper into the mountains, into terrain where Apache knowledge of every trail and hiding place would neutralize the advantages of modern weapons. The key would be Luna herself. Morrison's desperate need to capture Thunderheart's granddaughter would make him careless, force him to overextend his forces in pursuit of a prize that seemed within his grasp, but remained always just out of reach. "It is dangerous beyond measure," Stone Bear warned as the final details were hammered out. "If Luna falls into their hands, everything we have worked for dies with her. Then we make certain she does not fall," Raven said with quiet determination. "I have protected her this long. I will not fail now." But even as he spoke the words, Raven felt the cold touch of premonition. The plan they were crafting was sound in theory, but it relied on precise timing and flawless execution from men and women who had never worked together as a unified force. One mistake, one moment of confusion or hesitation, could result in catastrophe not just for Luna, but for the entire Apache resistance. As the War Council finally broke up in the hours before dawn, Raven found Luna sitting alone beside the dying council fire, staring into the glowing embers with an expression far too serious for her years. "Are you afraid?" he asked gently, settling beside her. Luna considered the question with characteristic gravity. "Yes," she said finally, "but not of dying. I'm afraid of failing everyone who believes in me." The honesty of her answer pierced Raven's heart. Here was a child who should have been playing games and learning stories from her grandmother, instead bearing the weight of an entire people's hopes on her small shoulders. "Your grandfather would be proud of you," he said softly. "I hope so," Luna replied, touching the silver locket at her throat. "Sometimes I can almost hear his voice, telling me to be strong, to remember that I am the daughter of chiefs and the granddaughter of legends. But mostly I just feel like a little girl who misses her parents and wishes the world was not so cruel." Raven gathered her into his arms, holding her close as the eastern sky began to lighten with the promise of dawn. In a few hours, Morrison's army would begin its final advance, and the fate of the Apache people would be decided in battle. But for this moment, he was simply a father comforting his daughter, and that was enough. The eagle-bone whistle lay beside Stone Bear's sleeping form, ready to sound the call to battle when the time came. Soon, its ancient song would echo across the mountains one final time, summoning the spirits of the ancestors to witness the last stand of the Apache nation, and at the center of it all would be Luna, Thunderheart's granddaughter, carrying the hopes and dreams of her people into an uncertain future. The battle standard fluttered in the mountain wind like a prayer made visible, its sacred symbols dancing against the dawn sky as Luna raised it high above the Apache defensive positions. The ancient banner had been crafted by Thunderheart's own hands from the hide of a white buffalo, painted with symbols that told the story of Apache resistance across generations. Now his granddaughter held it aloft, her small figure silhouetted against the rising sun, and every warrior who saw her felt the fire of their ancestors burning in their hearts. Morrison's army had begun their final advance before first light, moving up the canyon in carefully coordinated columns that spoke to the captain's military expertise. 500 soldiers against 200 Apache warriors. In any conventional battle, the outcome would have been foregone. But this was not conventional warfare, and these mountains had been Apache territory for 1,000 years. Raven crouched behind a wall of carefully arranged stones, his rifle loaded and ready, watching the approaching enemy through the crystal-clear morning air. The soldiers moved with the confidence of men who believed superior numbers and firepower guaranteed victory. They had not yet learned that the Apache way of war was about more than weapons and tactics. It was about becoming one with the land itself. "First volley at my signal," Stone Bear's voice carried softly along the defensive line. "Aim for the officers. Make every shot count." The plan they had crafted during the long night hours was elegant in its simplicity. The Apache would not meet Morrison's charge head-on, but would instead draw the soldiers deeper into a series of prepared positions where the terrain itself became a weapon. Each defensive line would inflict maximum casualties before falling back to the next, bleeding the enemy's strength while preserving their own forces for the final confrontation. Luna stood on a prominent outcrop where every Apache warrior could see her, the battle standard snapping proudly in the wind. Her presence served multiple purposes, inspiring their own fighters while drawing Morrison's attention away from the carefully concealed positions where the real killing would be done. The first shots rang out when the leading edge of cavalry reached the predetermined kill zone, a narrow passage between two towering rock formations. Apache marksmen, hidden among the boulders and cliff faces, opened fire with devastating accuracy. Soldiers tumbled from their saddles while their mounts reared and screamed in panic. Morrison's response was swift and professional. Dismounted infantry moved forward under covering fire from rifle companies positioned on the canyon floor, while artillery pieces began lobbing shells at suspected Apache positions. The sound of explosions echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, filling the air with smoke and flying stone fragments. But the Apache had fought this kind of battle before, against Mexican troops and American cavalry alike. They knew how to use the mountain's natural acoustics to confuse enemy fire, how to move through terrain that seemed impassable to conventional forces, how to strike without warning and vanish like morning mist. "Fall back to position 2, Stone Bear commanded as artillery fire intensified around their first defensive line. The Apache warriors melted away from their positions like shadows, moving through hidden paths and secret passages that had been prepared over weeks of careful planning. Morrison pressed his advance, pushing his soldiers forward through the killing ground where dozens of their comrades already lay still. The captain was no fool. He understood that he was walking into a trap, but he also knew that his mission demanded risks. Somewhere among these rocks and cliffs was the most valuable prize in the entire territory, and he would not leave without her. The second defensive position was a natural fortress formed by fallen boulders and wind-carved caves, invisible from below but commanding perfect fields of fire over the approaching soldiers. Here the Apache made their stand, pouring devastating volleys into Morrison's ranks as they struggled up the steep terrain. Luna had moved with the retreating warriors, always visible to both sides, the battle standard streaming behind her like a comet's tail. Her courage was infectious, warriors who might have broken under the intense artillery bombardment held their positions because Thunderheart's granddaughter stood firm among them. She has the heart of 10 warriors. Wind from the mountains called out during a brief lull in the fighting, and his words were taken up by others until they became a battle cry, the heart of 10 warriors. Morrison's flanking maneuver came from the east, where a company of infantry had worked their way through what appeared to be impassable terrain. The soldiers emerged from a hidden ravine like ghosts, catching a group of Apache defenders completely by surprise. "Ambush!" Raven shouted, turning his rifle toward the new threat. The carefully planned defense was beginning to unravel as soldiers poured through the breach, their bayonets glinting in the morning sun. But it was Luna who saved them. Seeing the danger to the surrounded warriors, she leaped onto a prominent boulder and raised the battle standard high above her head. The sight of Thunderheart's granddaughter standing fearless in the face of enemy fire galvanized every Apache within sight. Warriors who had been falling back suddenly reversed direction, charging toward the breakthrough with renewed fury. The surprised soldiers found themselves facing opponents who fought with the desperation of men protecting their most sacred treasure. The melee was brutal and brief. Apache wore clubs and knives, met army bayonets and rifle butts in close combat that left no room for mercy. When the dust cleared, the breakthrough had been contained, but at terrible cost. Nearly 30 Apache warriors lay dead or wounded. "We cannot hold here," Stone Bear said grimly as he surveyed their casualties. "Morrison has more men than we anticipated." Raven looked up at Luna, still standing on her boulder, with the battle standard held high despite the bullets that whined past her head. Her courage was absolute, but courage alone would not be enough against such overwhelming odds. "Position 3?" he asked. Stone Bear nodded reluctantly. Position 3 was their final prepared defensive line. Beyond that lay only the sacred caves where Apache women and children had sheltered during countless battles over the centuries. If they were driven from Position 3, there would be nowhere left to retreat. As the Apache began their third withdrawal, moving through passages so narrow that soldiers would have to advance in single file, Raven felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. Every step backward was another step toward the end of Apache freedom, another victory for those who would erase his people from the face of the earth. But Luna's courage never wavered. Even as enemy bullets chipped stone fragments from the rocks around her, she held the battle standard steady, her young voice rising in the ancient war songs her grandfather had taught her people. And somehow, impossibly, her spirit seemed to grow stronger as their situation grew more desperate. The war lance had belonged to Raven's father, and his father before him, passed down through generations of warriors who had carried it into battle against enemies both foreign and domestic. Its shaft was carved from mountain ash and decorated with eagle feathers and silver bands that caught the light like captured lightning. For 3 years, it had gathered dust in Raven's abandoned wickiup, but today he carried it into combat one final time. Morrison's final assault came with the fury of a desert thunderstorm, his remaining soldiers pouring up the narrow passages toward the Apache's last defensive position, like floodwater, seeking the easiest path downhill. The captain himself led from the front, his ornate compass forgotten in his belt as he focused on the prize that had eluded him for so long, the small figure holding the battle standard on the heights above. "Thunderheart's brat ends today," Morrison shouted to his men as they scrambled over the rocky terrain. $500 to the man who brings her to me alive." But the Apache had prepared one final surprise. As the soldiers emerged from the narrow passages into what appeared to be an open killing ground, Stone Bear's warriors rose from concealed positions like spirits materializing from the earth itself. The crossfire was devastating, cutting down the leading ranks before they could even raise their weapons. Morrison rallied his men with the skill of a veteran commander, organizing covering fire while his soldiers sought what shelter they could find among the scattered boulders. But for every Apache warrior who fell, 2 soldiers paid the price. These were men fighting for their homeland, their families, their very existence as a people, and that desperation made them more dangerous than any weapon Morrison's army could bring to bear. The battle raged for an hour in the thin mountain air, neither side able to gain decisive advantage. Apache marksmanship kept the soldiers pinned down, but Morrison's superior numbers gradually began to tell as he worked flanking parties around both sides of the defensive position. It was then that Luna made the decision that would be remembered in Apache songs for generations to come. Seeing that the battle was turning against her people, she leaped down from her protected position and ran directly toward the heaviest fighting, the battle standard streaming behind her like a war banner. "For Thunderheart," she cried in her clear young voice. "For all the Apache children who cannot fight for themselves." The sight of their 7-year-old leader charging fearlessly toward enemy guns galvanized every Apache warrior. Men who had been conserving ammunition suddenly poured devastating fire into Morrison's ranks. Warriors who had been falling back reversed course and threw themselves into hand-to-hand combat with renewed fury. But Luna's charge had also exposed her to terrible danger. Morrison himself spotted her movement and raised his rifle, drawing a careful bead on the small running figure. "Got you," he whispered, his finger tightening on the trigger. Raven saw the threat developing and reacted with the instincts of a man who had spent his life protecting others. Abandoning his covered position, he sprinted across the open ground between himself and Morrison. His father's war lance held ready for battle. The captain's shot went wide as Raven slammed into him like a thunderbolt, the impact sending both men tumbling across the rocky ground. Morrison recovered first, his military training serving him well as he rolled to his feet with his service pistol already in hand. "Ghost Walker," he said with grim satisfaction. "I've been looking forward to this." The duel that followed was brief but decisive. Morrison was younger and stronger, trained in the finest military academies and hardened by years of frontier warfare. But Raven fought with the accumulated wisdom of 37 years, every movement economical and precise. The war lance moved like a living thing in his hands, its ancient wood singing through the air as it deflected Morrison's desperate shots. When the captain's ammunition ran out, he drew his cavalry saber and pressed his attack with the fury of a man who had staked everything on this moment. Steel rang against ashwood as the 2 warriors circled each other on the narrow ledge, each looking for the opening that would end the fight. Below them, the battle continued to rage as Apache and army forces clashed among the rocks and crevices of the mountain fortress. Morrison's blade found its mark first, opening a deep gash across Raven's ribs that sent blood streaming down his side. But the wound only seemed to fuel the Apache warrior's determination. With a move taught to him by his grandfather, Raven trapped Morrison's sword arm and drove the war. Lance deep into the captain's chest, Morrison's eyes widened with shock and something approaching respect as he looked down at the ancient weapon that had ended his life. "Thunderheart's granddaughter," he gasped with his final breath. "She's everything they said she was." As Morrison fell, his death seemed to break the spirit of his surviving soldiers. Leaderless and trapped in terrain that favored their enemies, they began to retreat down the mountain passages, their organized advance dissolving into panicked flight. Luna found Raven kneeling beside Morrison's body, his hand pressed against the wound in his side. The war lance lay beside him, its blade dark with the blood of his enemy. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. Raven looked up at this remarkable child who had inspired an entire army with her courage and managed a weak smile. "It is over. We won." The family blanket had been woven by the finest craftswomen of 7 Apache bands, its intricate patterns telling the story of Thunderheart's granddaughter and the warrior who had protected her through the darkest of times. The traditional geometric designs were worked in colors that spoke of the sacred places: turquoise for the sky, red for the earth, white for the mountain snow, and gold for the desert sun. It was a masterpiece of Apache artistry, but more than that, it was a symbol of acceptance and belonging. 6 months had passed since the battle that ended Morrison's campaign and broke the back of the government's systematic removal of Apache children. The political ramifications of the military defeat had echoed all the way to Washington, where territorial officials found themselves answering difficult questions about the costs and ethics of their Indian policies. The planned forced relocations had been quietly suspended, and 3 of the government schools had been closed, following investigations into conditions that shocked even hardened army officers. Luna stood now before the assembled council of chiefs, no longer the frightened child who had been sold at auction, but not yet the woman she would become. At 7 years old, she occupied that magical space between childhood and responsibility, old enough to understand the weight of her heritage, but young enough to still find joy in simple pleasures. The council recognizes Luna, granddaughter of Thunderheart, daughter of Dancing Wolf, as a leader among our people, Stone Bear announced formally. But we also recognize her need to be a child, to learn and grow without the burden of expectation that has been placed upon her shoulders. The solution they had crafted was elegant and wise. Luna would spend the warm months with various Apache bands, learning the traditional skills and knowledge that were her birthright. But during the winter seasons, she would travel with Raven, exploring the world beyond Apache territory and gaining the broader understanding that would serve her well as a future leader. She will need to know both worlds. Grey Owl had argued during the long discussions that preceded this decision. The old ways alone will not be sufficient for the challenges she will face as a woman, but neither can she forget who she is and where she comes from. Raven himself had been formally adopted into Stone Bear's band, his status as Luna's protector and teacher recognized by ancient ceremony. The medicine pouch he wore now contained new items alongside the mementos of his first family: a strand of Luna's hair, a small stone she had painted, and a piece of turquoise from the sacred mountains where they had found their new beginning. The healing of his old wounds had been gradual but profound. The hollow space in his chest where grief had lived for so long was filled now with something warmer and more enduring: the love of a father for his daughter, chosen rather than born, but no less real for that choice. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he could still hear Singing Bird's voice offering approval, and he no longer wept when he thought of Little Fox and Morning Star. They lived on in his memory, but they no longer haunted his dreams. "Where will we go first?" Luna asked as they prepared for their winter journey. Her few possessions packed in a travel bundle that included her wooden horse and her grandfather's silver locket. "South," Raven replied, checking the balance of his new war lance, a gift from Stone Bear to replace the one that had been buried with Morrison according to Apache custom. "There are Apache bands in Mexico who should meet Thunderheart's granddaughter. And beyond that, there are cities where you can learn about the white man's world without being in danger from it." Hawk and Dove had chosen to remain with Stone Bear's band, finding healing and belonging among the extended family of warriors and elders who had accepted them as their own. They had grown strong during the months of peace, their nightmares fading as they learned traditional skills and formed new friendships. But they still regarded Luna with something approaching worship, understanding that it was her courage that had saved them all. "Will you come back?" Dove asked as they prepared to say goodbye. "Every spring," Luna promised, embracing the younger girl with the fierce affection of an older sister. "And when I do, I want to hear all about everything you've learned." As they set out from the mountain stronghold, the family blanket wrapped around Luna's shoulders against the autumn chill, Raven reflected on the changes that had transformed all their lives. He had begun this journey as a hollow man, seeking nothing more than revenge against a cruel world. He had found instead a purpose larger than vengeance and a love deeper than grief. Luna rode beside him on a gentle mare that Stone Bear had given her, chattering excitedly about the adventures that lay ahead, while carefully maintaining the dignified posture that befitted Thunderheart's granddaughter. She was becoming exactly what her grandfather would have wanted: strong without being hard, wise without being cynical, proud of her heritage but open to learning from other peoples and cultures. The late afternoon sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson as they made their first camp. The family blanket spread beside a small fire that crackled cheerfully in the gathering dusk. Luna practiced the songs that Singing Dove had taught her, while Raven prepared their simple meal, both of them content in the knowledge that they had found what every human heart seeks: a place to belong and people to love. "Tell me about the cities we'll visit," Luna requested as they settled down for the night, her head pillowed on Raven's shoulder. "There are wonders you cannot imagine," Raven replied softly. "Buildings that reach toward the sky like stone mountains, machines that move without horses to pull them, and libraries filled with more books than there are stars in the heavens." "But we'll always come home?" Luna asked, her voice growing drowsy. "Always," Raven promised, and knew that home was no longer a place but a connection, the bond between a warrior and the child he had chosen to protect, the love that had transformed them both from refugees into a family above them. The same stars that had guided Apache peoples for countless generations continued their eternal dance across the desert sky, silent witnesses to the enduring power of love to heal even the deepest wounds.